The morning sun stretched across Arlington National Cemetery like golden fingers reaching through the trees, and Officer Danny Price stood at the main entrance checking identification cards and security badges with the kind of efficiency that came from doing the same job for 5 years straight, and he was good at it too, because he could spot trouble from 50 yards away. Or at least, that's what he told himself every morning when he put on his uniform. And today was special, because they were burying Captain Marcus Sullivan, who had died defending one of Earth's outer colonies from alien raiders called the Kryn, and the whole galaxy seemed to be watching because representatives from at least 12 different alien species had come to pay their respects, and Danny had to make sure every single one of them had proper clearance because not everyone in the galaxy loved humans, and some might see this as an opportunity to cause problems. And the protocol was clear and simple, which meant check everyone and trust no one until their credentials came back clean and verified, and Danny took that responsibility seriously, because these fallen soldiers deserved respect and protection even in death, and he wasn't going to let anyone disrupt that sacred moment. The crowd was growing larger by the minute, with military personnel in their dress uniforms standing alongside civilian mourners and alien dignitaries whose appearances ranged from almost human to completely incomprehensible, and Danny had seen a lot in his 5 years working cemetery security. But he never got used to the Kravik ambassadors with their forearms and chitinous bodies that looked like they belonged in a nightmare rather than a diplomatic ceremony. And there were the Valorians, too, with their translucent skin that seemed to glow faintly in the sunlight, and dozens of other species, whose names Danny could never quite remember. But he checked them all with the same careful attention, because that was his job, and he was proud of it, and the scanner in his hand beeped steadily as he verified credentials one after another. And everything was going smoothly, until he noticed the man walking past the checkpoint without stopping. And something about that man made Danny's instincts flare up like warning lights in a control room. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark skin and gray hair cut military short, and he wore an expensive black suit that probably cost more than Danny made in a month. But that wasn't what bothered Danny, because plenty of people wore expensive clothes to funerals, and what bothered him was the way the man moved with a kind of awareness that seemed almost predatory, like he was constantly scanning for threats and calculating distances and exit routes, and Danny had seen that walk before, in combat veterans who never quite left the battlefield behind. And the man's eyes swept across the crowd with quick, efficient movements that missed nothing, and his posture was too perfect, too controlled, and there were no visible rank insignia, or unit patches, or anything that identified him as military. But everything about his bearing screamed soldier, and Danny felt his hand drift toward his stunner as the man approached the funeral area without presenting credentials. Danny called out in his most professional voice, which was firm but not aggressive, because he had learned early in his career that tone mattered almost as much as words. And he said, "Excuse me, sir, but I need to see your identification." And the man stopped mid-stride and turned slowly with the kind of careful deliberation that made Danny even more nervous. And the man's face was neutral, showing no anger or surprise or really any emotion at all. And his dark eyes met Danny's with a directness that was almost uncomfortable. And there was something in that gaze that made Danny feel like he was being evaluated and measured, and possibly found wanting. And the man said nothing for a long moment, just stood there watching Danny with that same neutral expression. And Danny noticed that several other mourners had stopped to watch the interaction, and some of them were military officers with rows of medals on their chests, and others were civilians with cameras and recording devices, and the attention made Danny more determined to follow protocol exactly. The man finally spoke in a voice that was quiet, but somehow carried authority, and he said, "I'm here for the funeral, officer." And Danny nodded, because of course the man was here for the funeral. But that didn't change the requirements, and Danny replied, with as much professionalism as he could manage, that he understood, but still needed to see proper identification and security clearance. And the man's expression flickered, just slightly, with what might have been disappointment or resignation, and Danny couldn't tell which. And the man reached slowly into his jacket pocket, moving with exaggerated care like he knew exactly how nervous movements could be misinterpreted. And Danny's hand stayed near his stunner just in case, because you never knew, and the man pulled out a small black wallet and extracted a card which he handed to Danny without comment or complaint. Danny took the card and scanned it quickly, noting the name Lawrence Tucker, and the identification listed him as a civilian with no military affiliation and no government position, and nothing that explained why he would be at a high-security military funeral. And Danny ran the card through his electronic scanner expecting to get the usual detailed background information, but instead, the device beeped once and displayed a message that Danny had never seen before, and the message said, "Clearance, level verified and no further inquiry required," and that was it, and nothing else. And Danny frowned at the screen because that wasn't normal protocol, and normally the scanner would display detailed information about security clearances and background checks and all sorts of verification data, but this was just a blank authorization. And Danny's training told him that blank authorizations were suspicious and possibly dangerous, and he looked up at Lawrence Tucker, who was waiting patiently with that same neutral expression, and Danny made a decision. Danny said, "Sir, I'm going to need you to wait here while I verify this with my supervisor." And he tried to keep his voice professional and courteous but firm, and Lawrence Tucker's expression changed for just a moment, and the neutrality cracked, slightly to reveal something that looked like deep weariness and disappointment. And the man said, "Very well, officer," in that same quiet, authoritative voice, and he stepped to the side to wait, and Danny noticed that the watching crowd had grown larger and more attentive, and several people were whispering to each other and pointing, and a Kravik ambassador was approaching with his human liaison, and Danny felt a knot forming in his stomach because he was just following protocol and doing his job. But something about this situation felt wrong, and he couldn't quite identify what it was. The Kravik ambassador stopped in front of Danny, and his translator device hummed and clicked before producing words in metallic English. And the ambassador asked if there was a problem, and Danny replied that he was just conducting standard security checks, and the Kravik's multiple eyes focused on Lawrence Tucker with an intensity that seemed almost reverent. And the ambassador said that among his people, detaining a warrior at another warrior's funeral was considered a grave insult, and he assumed humans had similar customs, and Danny felt heat rising to his face because the implication was clear. And he said again that he was just doing his job and following proper protocol. And the ambassador made a clicking sound that the translator didn't bother to interpret and turned away, and Danny looked at Lawrence Tucker, who was still waiting patiently, and the man's expression had returned to that neutral mask, but his eyes held something that might have been understanding or pity, and Danny wasn't sure which would be worse. Word spread through the crowd faster than Danny expected, and he could see clusters of people whispering and pointing toward where Lawrence Tucker stood waiting patiently at the checkpoint. And some of the whispers were loud enough for Danny to catch fragments about a black man being detained in civilian clothes in security theater, and Danny felt his jaw tighten, because he wasn't profiling anyone, and he was just following standard procedure, and it didn't matter what color someone's skin was or what they wore, because protocol was protocol and everyone got checked the same way. And that's what Danny told himself, even as doubt started creeping into his mind like cold water seeping through cracks, and he wondered if maybe his reaction had been influenced by something he didn't want to acknowledge, and the thought made him uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with security concerns. More people were gathering now, and Danny saw military officers in their dress uniforms standing in small groups and watching the situation unfold, and some of them looked angry, while others looked curious, and a few looked disappointed, and that last expression bothered Danny more than the anger, because disappointment meant they expected better and he was trying to do better, but he was also trying to do his job, and those two things seemed to be in conflict right now, and he pressed the button on his radio to call his supervisor, Sergeant Williams, who had 20 years of experience and would know how to handle this situation properly. And while he waited for Williams to arrive, Danny tried to ignore the growing attention and the way Lawrence Tucker stood there with infinite patience, like a man who had been through this exact scenario before and knew exactly how it would end. A woman in a major's uniform stepped forward from the crowd, and her name tag read, Chen. And she had multiple combat ribbons on her chest, including some that Danny recognized as being awarded only for exceptional valor in combat situations, and Major Chen walked right up to Danny with the kind of confidence that came from command experience. And she said in a voice that carried clear authority that the man Danny was detaining was cleared to be here, and she suggested very strongly that Danny release him immediately. And Danny felt his face getting hot because he didn't appreciate being told how to do his job by someone who wasn't in his chain of command, even if she outranked him technically, and he replied with as much respect as he could manage that he was following proper protocol, and the credentials didn't match standard formats, and Major Chen's expression hardened like steel cooling, and she said that some credentials don't follow standard formats, especially when they belong to legends. Danny wanted to ask what she meant by legends, but Sergeant Williams arrived before he could. And Williams was a big man with gray hair and a face that had seen everything twice, and he looked annoyed at being called away from his morning coffee. And he asked what the situation was in a tone that suggested he expected this to be simple and easily resolved. And Danny explained everything carefully about the man walking past the checkpoint and the unusual scanner response and the blank authorization, and Williams listened with growing concern, and then took the identification card from Danny and scanned it himself. And Danny watched as his supervisor's face went from annoyed to confused to pale in the space of about 3 seconds, and Williams stared at the scanner like it had just told him the world was ending. And then he looked at Lawrence Tucker with an expression that Danny had never seen on his supervisor's face before, and it looked almost like fear mixed with respect. Williams asked Danny in a very quiet voice if he had any idea who this man was, and Danny said what he knew, which was just the name Lawrence Tucker and the civilian designation, and Williams closed his eyes briefly, like he was in pain, and then handed the card back to Lawrence with careful respect, and apologized for the delay and said that Tucker was cleared to proceed, and Lawrence nodded once and walked past them toward the funeral area, and the crowd actually parted for him like water, flowing around a stone, and Danny noticed something strange, which was that several of the alien dignitaries bowed slightly as Lawrence passed, and not the casual head nod that humans sometimes did, but actual formal bows of respect. And the Kravik ambassador who had questioned Danny earlier actually placed all 4 of his hands over his chest in what must have been some kind of salute, and Lawrence acknowledged each gesture with small nods, but kept walking with that same careful, controlled movement. Danny turned to Williams and asked who Lawrence Tucker was, and Williams didn't answer immediately, and instead he watched Tucker's retreating figure until the man took a seat near the front row beside several high-ranking military officers who greeted him with obvious respect and deference, and then Williams sighed deeply like a man about to deliver bad news, and he told Danny to come with him away from the checkpoint and away from the crowd, and they walked to a quieter section of the cemetery where they could talk privately, and Williams stood there for a moment collecting his thoughts, and Danny waited with growing anxiety because his supervisor looked genuinely troubled, and that was rare because Williams had seen combat and had worked security for 2 decades and nothing rattled him. But something about Lawrence Tucker had definitely rattled him. Williams began talking, and his voice was serious and measured, and he started by asking Danny what he knew about the First Contact War. And Danny said he knew the basics because everyone learned about it in school, and it was the war that happened 30 years ago when humanity first joined the galactic community and got attacked by the Kryn Dominion, who saw humans as weak and easy targets. And Williams nodded and said that was the simplified version. But the reality was much worse, because the Kryn didn't just attack military targets, and they went after civilian colony ships and stations and killed thousands of people in the first few months. And the Galactic Council did nothing except offer condolences and thoughts and prayers, which didn't bring back the dead or stop future attacks, and so Earth's military had to respond, and they created something new, and something the galaxy hadn't seen before. Williams explained that the military formed small specialized teams trained for deep space operations behind enemy lines, and these teams were different from conventional forces because they operated independently without resupply or reinforcements, and they used tactics that the Kryn couldn't predict or counter. And the most successful of these teams was Strike Team 7, and Williams paused there and looked at Danny directly and said that Lawrence Tucker was the commanding officer of Strike Team 7. And he was the man who led humanity's counteroffensive against the Kryn. And Danny felt his stomach drop, because he suddenly understood that he had detained a war hero and questioned his right to attend a military funeral. And the realization made him feel sick, and Williams continued explaining that Tucker and his team operated behind Kryn lines for 3 years, and they hit supply convoys and command stations and fleet positions, and they did it with only 12 people against an entire empire. Danny asked why Tucker wasn't wearing a uniform or displaying rank, and Williams smiled grimly and said that was complicated because the war had cost Tucker something that medals and promotions couldn't fix, and Strike Team 7 had started with 12 members, but only 4 made it home alive, and Tucker blamed himself for every loss. And when the war ended, he retired immediately and refused all awards and declined every ceremony, and he said he was done being a soldier and done sending people to die, but he still attended military funerals for anyone who died serving Earth. And it didn't matter if he knew them personally, because he believed every person who served deserved to be remembered by someone who understood sacrifice. And Williams said that the alien dignitaries who bowed to Tucker did so because their species fought alongside Earth, and they knew what he had accomplished, and they respected him in ways that transcended politics or protocol. Danny stood there processing what Williams had just told him, and the weight of his mistake settled on his shoulders like physical pressure. And he had detained a legend and questioned a hero, and done it in front of hundreds of witnesses, including alien dignitaries who understood Tucker's significance better than Danny had. And Williams pulled out his datapad and showed Danny an old photograph that looked like it had been taken from combat footage, and the image quality was poor and grainy, but Danny could still make out the details, and there was a younger Lawrence Tucker, standing in what looked like the ruins of an alien warship, and his armor was cracked and scorched, and he was covered in what might have been blood, and he held a rifle that looked like it had been assembled from salvaged parts, and behind him were other soldiers in similar condition, and some were standing while others were being supported by their teammates, and all of them looked exhausted, but unbroken. Williams explained that this photo was taken after the Battle of Kepler Station, where Strike Team 7 held off a Kryn assault force for 8 hours, while civilian transports evacuated, and they were outnumbered 50-1 and had limited ammunition and no air support, but they held the line because that's what soldiers do when civilians need protecting. And Williams said that Tucker lost 3 team members in that battle, including his best friend and second in command. And the Kryn eventually retreated, not because they ran out of troops, but because they were so shocked that 12 humans could inflict that much damage, and the battle became legendary in galactic military circles because it proved that humans were not prey, and that humanity would fight with a ferocity that other species couldn't match. And the Kryn never attacked a human colony again after Kepler Station. Danny asked why Tucker retired so young if he was that good, and Williams said that being good at killing came with a price, and Tucker had seen too much and lost too many people and carried too much guilt. And when the war finally ended, the military wanted to promote him to general and give him medals and make him into a recruiting poster. But Tucker refused everything, and he said he was done watching people die and done making impossible choices about who lived and who got left behind, and he disappeared into civilian life and bought a small house somewhere quiet. And the only time anyone saw him was at military funerals, where he paid respects to fallen soldiers. And Williams said that Tucker kept a list of every human casualty from the First Contact War and reviewed it weekly to remember their names and faces. And he attended as many funerals as he physically could because he believed they deserved to be honored by someone who understood combat. Williams put away his datapad and looked at Danny seriously, and said that what happened at the checkpoint was going to follow Danny for a while, because word spreads fast in military circles and people would remember that he detained Lawrence Tucker and questioned his credentials, and some would understand that Danny was following protocol while others would see it as disrespect, or worse, as profiling. And Williams said that Danny needed to decide what kind of officer he wanted to be, because this was a learning moment and he could either grow from it or make excuses, and Danny asked what he should do. And Williams said the first step was acknowledging the mistake and understanding why it happened, and then making sure it never happened again. And that meant examining his own biases and assumptions and being honest about whether Lawrence Tucker would have been detained if he had been white and wearing a military uniform. Danny wanted to argue that skin color hadn't factored into his decision, but the word stuck in his throat because he couldn't be completely sure, and maybe there was something in the back of his mind that had flagged Tucker as suspicious based on appearance rather than behavior, and the thought made Danny uncomfortable. But Williams said discomfort was good because it meant Danny was thinking critically and examining himself, and that was more than most people did. And Williams told Danny to watch the funeral from a distance and observe how people treated Tucker, and maybe that would help Danny understand what he had almost disrupted. And then Williams walked back toward the main entrance, leaving Danny alone with his thoughts and his guilt and his growing understanding that being a good officer required more than following protocol. Danny found a spot near the back where he could watch the ceremony without interfering, and the funeral was proceeding with military precision, and Captain Sullivan's casket was draped with Earth's flag, and honor guards stood at perfect attention, and speakers took turns at the podium sharing memories and honoring the fallen officer. And Danny noticed that Lawrence Tucker sat quietly in the front row, and his posture was rigid and formal, and his face showed nothing, but Danny could see tension in Tucker's shoulders and the way his hands gripped the edge of his seat. And this was clearly difficult for him, but he was here anyway because he had made a commitment to remember and honor those who served. And Danny wondered how many funerals Tucker had attended over the years and how much grief one person could carry before it became too heavy. The Kravik ambassador spoke first, and his translator converted his clicking speech into metallic English. And he talked about Captain Sullivan's courage and how he died protecting innocent civilians from raiders. And the ambassador said that warriors like Sullivan were remembered forever among his people, and that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. And then Sullivan's commanding officer, Admiral Keene, took the podium, and she spoke about his dedication and his leadership and his unwavering commitment to protecting Earth's colonies, and her voice was thick with emotion, and she said that Sullivan was one of their finest and would be deeply missed. And there were tears in many eyes, including some of the alien dignitaries who apparently understood grief even across species barriers. Then something unexpected happened, and Admiral Keene paused and looked directly at Lawrence Tucker and asked if he would say a few words, and the entire cemetery went silent. And even the wind seemed to stop, and Danny held his breath because he suddenly understood that this was significant. And Tucker hesitated for a long moment, and Danny thought he might refuse, but then Tucker stood slowly and walked to the podium with that same careful, controlled movement. And he stood there looking at the flag-draped casket, and for just an instant his mask slipped, and Danny saw raw pain underneath and the kind of grief that comes from losing too many people over too many years. And then Tucker gathered himself and began speaking in a voice that was low but somehow carried across the silent cemetery. Tucker said he hadn't known Captain Sullivan personally, but he knew what Sullivan represented, and he talked about courage and sacrifice, and the willingness to stand between darkness and innocence who needed protection. And he said that when humanity joined the galaxy, they were naive and thought everyone shared their values, but learned quickly that wasn't true. And they also learned that humans don't break when pushed, and instead they adapt and fight and survive. And Tucker's hands gripped the podium, and he said that Captain Sullivan proved that by giving everything to protect people he would never meet, and that made Sullivan family not by blood but by choice, and by shared commitment to something bigger than themselves. And Tucker said they would remember Sullivan not just for how he died, but for how he lived with honor and purpose, and when the next crisis came, they would remember his example and be ready. The crowd erupted in applause when Tucker finished speaking, and it wasn't the polite ceremonial clapping that usually happened at military funerals, but something fierce and genuine and full of emotion, and people were nodding and wiping tears, and even some of the alien dignitaries made sounds that their translators interpreted as approval and respect. And Tucker stepped back from the podium looking uncomfortable with the attention and returned to his seat, and Danny noticed that several military officers were saluting, and these weren't casual salutes, but full formal gestures with crisp precision and the kind reserved for the highest ranks. And Tucker couldn't salute back because he wasn't in uniform, but he nodded to each officer, acknowledging their respect, and Danny felt his shame deepen because he had almost prevented this moment and almost stopped Tucker from honoring a fallen soldier, and the crowd would have missed hearing words from someone who truly understood sacrifice. The ceremony continued with the traditional elements, including the folding of the flag and the playing of taps and the three-volley salute, and each part was performed with precision and dignity. And when it finally ended, people began moving slowly toward the reception area, but many stopped to speak with Tucker first, and Danny watched as military personnel and civilians and alien dignitaries all approached the man with obvious respect, and Tucker greeted each one quietly and listened to their words and shook hands or accepted whatever gestures of respect each species offered. And he seemed tired but also somehow lighter, like speaking at the funeral had released some pressure he had been carrying. And Danny wanted to approach Tucker and apologize properly, but he wasn't sure he had the right after what he had done at the checkpoint. Danny saw Tucker eventually break away from the crowd and walk toward a different section of the cemetery, and something made Danny follow at a distance, and he kept far enough back to not intrude, but close enough to see where Tucker was. going, and Tucker walked to the memorial wall where thousands of names were engraved in black stone, and these were the names of everyone who had died serving Earth in the decades since first contact. And Tucker stopped in front of one section and placed his hand on the stone, and his fingers traced letters that Danny couldn't read from his position. And Tucker stood there for several minutes, not moving and barely breathing, and Danny realized this must be where Strike Team 7 was memorialized, and those were the names of Tucker's teammates who hadn't made it home and the people he blamed himself for losing. Danny gathered his courage and walked closer and cleared his throat softly and said, "Excuse me, sir," and Tucker turned and his expression was unreadable, and he said, "Officer Price," in a neutral tone, and Danny took a breath and said he wanted to apologize because he hadn't known who Tucker was and shouldn't have detained him. And Tucker studied him for a moment, then shook his head and said that Danny was doing his job in security matters, especially at events like military funerals, and he shouldn't apologize for following protocol. And Danny forced himself to be honest and said that he had profiled Tucker and seen a black man in civilian clothes and assumed he didn't belong, and that wasn't protocol but prejudice. And Tucker's expression softened slightly, and he said that recognition matters, and the fact that Danny could admit that put him ahead of most people. And the question was what Danny would do next. Danny asked what he should do, and Tucker gestured to the memorial wall behind him and said that these names represented every human who died defending Earth's interests in the galaxy, and they included officers and enlisted personnel and civilians and every skin color and every background, and what united them wasn't appearance but belief in something worth protecting. And Tucker pointed to specific names and told their stories, and he said that Corporal Angela Martinez saved his life at Kepler Station by throwing herself on a plasma grenade to protect the squad, and Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka was the best pilot Tucker ever saw and held off 6 Kryn fighters while their transport escaped but didn't make it out herself, and Sergeant Leon Carter and Private Samantha Woods and Commander Jin Park, and the list continued, and each name was a person and each person was a sacrifice. And Tucker's voice remained steady, but Danny could hear the weight of memory behind every word. Tucker said that when Danny saw someone at a ceremony like this, he shouldn't assume based on appearance, but should assume they earned the right to be there and assume they lost someone or sacrificed something, and if verification was necessary, then it should be done with respect and dignity. And Danny nodded slowly and asked why Tucker retired if he was the best, and Tucker was quiet for a long moment, then said that being the best meant watching good people die and making impossible choices about trading lives like currency. And after a while he couldn't look at himself anymore, and he came to funerals because he owed it to the dead, and every person who served deserved to be remembered by someone who understood what they gave up. And Danny noticed that Tucker's hand had returned to the wall and was touching a specific section with 7 names clustered together, and Danny said quietly that those were his team, and Tucker's hand remained on the stone, and he said they were his family and they trusted him to bring them home, and 8 of them never made it. Before Danny could respond, Major Chen approached, and she had changed from her dress uniform into casual clothes, but still carried herself with military bearing, and she called Tucker by his rank, saying Colonel Tucker, and snapped to attention. And Tucker turned, and for just a moment Danny saw him shift, and the civilian facade dropped and was replaced by something harder and more dangerous, and the bearing of someone who had commanded soldiers in impossible situations. And Tucker said Major Chen at ease, and that he wasn't a colonel anymore, but Chen smiled and said that with respect, Tucker would always be a colonel to those who studied his tactics, and that half the strike operations they ran today were based on his playbook. And she glanced at Danny and said she saw he had met Officer Price, and Tucker said simply that they had cleared the air. Chen pulled out her datapad and said she wanted to show Tucker something about Captain Sullivan, and with permission from Sullivan's family she had been allowed to read his personal journal. And there was an entry from 2 years ago where Sullivan attended a military history lecture that Tucker gave at the academy, and apparently it changed Sullivan's entire perspective on leadership. And Chen handed the datapad to Tucker and said that Sullivan wrote about something. Tucker said that stuck with him about how the measure of a leader isn't victories but how many people they bring home, and Tucker read silently, and Danny watched his expression shift through pain and pride and regret. And Chen continued, saying that Sullivan credited Tucker with saving his crew, because when their ship was ambushed, Sullivan used tactics from Tucker's operations manual and got everyone to escape. pods before the reactor exploded, and everyone survived except Sullivan himself, who went down with his ship. Tucker closed his eyes briefly and handed back the data pad and said, "That's the job," and the captain goes down with the ship, and Chen straightened and said that Sullivan's crew wanted Tucker to know they were alive because of what he taught there. Captain and a Kravik official approached, interrupting the moment, and it was the same ambassador who had questioned Danny earlier at the checkpoint, and the ambassador said he must speak with Tucker. And Tucker turned with his diplomatic mask sliding back into place and acknowledged the ambassador politely, and the Kravik's multiple eyes studied Tucker with obvious respect, and the ambassador said his government wished to extend an invitation because next month marked the 30th anniversary of the Treaty of Kepler, and they would be honored if Tucker would attend the ceremony on the Kravik homeworld. Tucker hesitated and said he appreciated the gesture, but he was retired, and the ambassador clicked his mandibles and said that Tucker was retired from military service, but not from history, and the Kravik people wished to honor the human warriors who stood with them against the Kryn, and Tucker's name was sung in their combat halls, and his tactics were taught to their youth. And the ambassador gestured with one of his forearms and said that Tucker showed the galaxy that humans are not prey and that humanity fights with honor and cunning, and this must be remembered. And Tucker was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of the ambassador's words, and then he nodded once and said he would consider it, and thanked the ambassador, who bowed low in the deep gesture of respect that his species reserved for great warriors, and then withdrew. Major Chen smiled and said that Tucker knew he was going to accept the invitation, and Tucker allowed himself a small smile and said, probably, because he couldn't let humanity's reputation suffer, because he was uncomfortable with attention, and then he turned to Danny and asked if he would walk with him for a moment, and Danny agreed immediately, and they left Chen behind and walked through the cemetery in silence for several minutes, passing rows of white headstones that marked the resting places of soldiers from dozens of conflicts, and finally Tucker stopped at a small memorial bench that overlooked a valley, and sat down and gestured for Danny to join him, and Danny sat nervously wondering what Tucker wanted to discuss. Tucker said without preamble that Danny wanted to know about the medals because everyone always wanted to know about the medals, and Danny hadn't actually asked, but he was curious. And Tucker reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather case and opened it to reveal 6 medals, and each one represented different commendations, and they were the highest military honors that Earth could bestow. And Tucker pointed to the first one and said it was the Medal of Valor awarded for actions during the Battle of Kepler Station, where they held off a Kryn assault for 8 hours while civilian transports evacuated, and they lost 3 team members, and the Star of Terra was awarded after they destroyed the Kryn command carrier at New Horizon, and that operation took 6 months of planning and cost 2 more soldiers. Tucker pointed to each medal in turn, and with each one came a story, and these weren't tales of glory, but accounts of sacrifice and impossible odds and terrible costs. And there was the Distinguished Service Cross, and the Galactic Alliance Medal, and the Silver Phoenix, and each one represented missions that most people would never hear about in detail, and operations that happened in the shadows, while the public focused on conventional warfare. And Danny asked why Tucker carried the medals, if he didn't wear them. And Tucker closed the case carefully and said they reminded him of the price because every medal came at the cost of someone's life, and soldiers under his command who trusted him to make the right calls, and he carried them as penance. Danny said that's not how medals work, and Tucker looked at him directly and asked, isn't it because the medals supposedly represented courage and sacrifice, but whose courage and whose sacrifice? And Tucker was alive while the people who earned these medals were dead. And Danny didn't have an answer for that, and Tucker sat back against the bench, suddenly looking every one of his 65 years, and said that after the war ended, Earth wanted parades and ceremonies, and they wanted to make Strike Team 7 into heroes and recruiting tools. But they weren't heroes, and they were just survivors who got lucky more times than they deserved. And Danny said that Tucker saved humanity from the Kryn, and asked how that wasn't heroic. And Tucker's voice was quiet but firm, and he said because they didn't save everyone. Tucker explained that 3,000 civilians died in the first Kryn attack, and hundreds more in subsequent raids before Strike Team 7 figured out how to fight back effectively. And every person they couldn't save was a name he remembered. And he pulled out his datapad and showed Danny a file, and it was enormous with thousands of entries, and each entry had a name and a face and brief biographical information. And Tucker said this was every human casualty from the First Contact War. and he reviewed the list every week to remember and to honor them. And Danny felt something tighten in his chest, and said that Tucker couldn't carry all of that, and Tucker said someone has to, because the galaxy moves on to new conflicts and new threats, but these people deserve to be remembered by someone who understood what they lost. A group of officers walked past and noticed Tucker and stopped to salute, and Tucker acknowledged them with a nod, but didn't return the gesture because he couldn't without a uniform. And Danny observed that people still saw Tucker as military, and Tucker said that was because they didn't serve under him and didn't know what it cost. And he stood slowly and said there was one more thing he wanted to show Danny. And they walked to a newer section of the cemetery where the headstones were simpler and less ornate, but each one bore the same inscription which read Earth Colonial Defense Initiative, and Tucker said that Captain Sullivan would be buried here among the defenders and people who gave everything for humanity's future in space. Tucker knelt beside one particular grave, and the stone read, Lieutenant Commander Helen Briggs. Strike Team 7 died in service to humanity. And Tucker said quietly that she was his second in command and the best tactical mind he ever worked with, and she died covering their extraction at the Battle of New Horizon, and held off an entire platoon of Kryn warriors for 10 minutes alone. And Tucker placed his hand on the stone and said he thought about her every day and about what she could have accomplished if she had survived, and the lives she could have saved and the students she could have taught. And Danny knelt beside him and asked what she would think about Tucker carrying this weight, and Tucker smiled sadly and said she would tell him he was being an idiot and that they all knew the risks and that dying for something bigger than yourself is the whole point of service. Tucker stood and brushed dirt from his knees and said, That's the thing about survivor's guilt, and it doesn't care about logic and it just exists. And a voice called out across the cemetery, and Tucker turned to see Admiral Keene approaching with several other high-ranking officers, and the Admiral's expression was serious and urgent, and she said she needed to speak with Tucker. And it was important, and Tucker's demeanor shifted immediately, and the relaxed, grieving veteran disappeared, and was replaced by something sharper and more focused, and he asked what the situation was in the tone of someone used to receiving critical intelligence briefings. And the Admiral glanced at Danny and then back to Tucker and said they had received intelligence about a new threat. The Admiral explained that a species called the Varath had been attacking colony worlds on the outer rim, and the attacks were systematic and coordinated, and Earth's military analysts believed the Varath were testing human defenses and looking for weaknesses. And Tucker's jaw tightened, and he asked how many casualties, and the Admiral's voice was grim. And she said 2,000 so far across 4 different colonies, and conventional forces were being mobilized. But the Galactic Council wanted Earth to form a new strike team, and something similar to the old Strike Team 7, and Tucker said firmly that he was retired, and the Admiral pulled out her datapad and said they weren't asking him to lead the team, but to train them, and to teach the next generation how to survive behind enemy lines, and how to turn humanity's adaptability into a weapon. Tucker was silent for a long moment, and Danny could see the conflict in his eyes and the weight of the past versus the needs of the present. And Tucker was clearly torn between his desire to stay retired and his sense of duty to protect humanity. And finally Tucker spoke and said he would need full autonomy, and no political interference, and no rushing the training because someone wanted quick results. And the Admiral said done immediately without hesitation. And Tucker continued and said he wanted veto power over personnel, and if he said someone wasn't ready, then they didn't deploy. And the Admiral agreed, and Tucker looked back at Lieutenant Commander Briggs's grave and said one more condition, which was that every member of the new team must visit this cemetery and learn the names and understand the cost before they ever saw combat. The Admiral smiled slightly and said she thought that could be arranged, and asked if this meant Tucker was accepting. And Tucker sighed deeply and said that Helen would tell him he was being an idiot if he said no. So yes, he would train them. But they answered to him until they were ready, and no exceptions, and the Admiral extended her hand and said, "Welcome back, Colonel." And they shook hands, and Danny noticed something, which was that for the first time since their encounter began, Tucker looked like he was carrying less weight and not completely unburdened, but lighter, and like maybe he had found a purpose again and a way to honor the dead by preparing the living. As the officers left to discuss logistics, Tucker turned to Danny one last time and said that earlier Danny had asked what he should do and how to make amends for the mistake at the gate, and Danny said, "Yes, sir." And Tucker's expression was serious, but not unkind, and he said to learn from it and recognize his biases and challenge them. and when he encountered someone who seemed out of place, he should give them the benefit of the doubt, because you never know who they are, or what they've sacrificed. And Tucker reached into his jacket and pulled out something and handed it to Danny, and it was one of his medals, and specifically the Medal of Valor. And Danny said he couldn't take it, but Tucker said he wasn't taking it, and Tucker was giving it to him, and not as a reward but as a reminder. Tucker explained that the medal represented Corporal Angela Martinez, who was the soldier he had mentioned earlier, and she was a security officer before she joined Strike Team 7, and just like Danny, and Tucker's voice was firm, and he said Danny should remember her, and when he was on duty making decisions about who belongs and who doesn't, he should think about what she stood for, which was protection and service and sacrifice, and not judgment based on appearance. And Danny held the medal, carefully feeling its weight, both physical and symbolic, and he understood that this wasn't just a piece of metal, but a responsibility and a trust that Tucker was placing in him. Tucker started to walk away and then paused and turned back and said that when he started training the new strike team, Danny should come by the facility because Tucker could use someone who understood the cost of prejudice and someone who could help ensure the next generation did better. And Danny straightened unconsciously, coming to attention, and said he would be honored, and Tucker nodded once and walked toward Admiral Keene and the other officers. And as he went, more people noticed him, and more salutes were given and more nods of respect were exchanged, and Danny watched and finally understood that Lawrence Tucker wasn't just a retired soldier but a living reminder of what humanity could be when pushed to its limits, and a symbol of the price of freedom and the burden of survival. Danny looked down at the Medal of Valor in his hand and thought about Corporal Martinez, and how she had thrown herself on a grenade to save her teammates, and how she had been a security officer just like him before joining Strike Team 7, and he wondered if he would have that kind of courage when it mattered, and if he could learn to see people the way Tucker did, and not through the lens of assumptions and prejudices, but through the lens of shared humanity and shared sacrifice. And he put the medal carefully in his pocket and made a silent promise to Martinez and to Tucker that he would do better and be better, and remember that everyone deserves respect until they prove otherwise. The funeral was ending and people were leaving in small groups, and some were heading to the reception, while others were returning to their duties, and Danny watched Tucker standing with the admirals and generals and planning humanity's next defense. And he looked different now and more alive somehow, and like the weight he carried had shifted from crushing guilt to purposeful responsibility, and Danny understood that Tucker had never really retired, because you can't retire from caring about people, and you can't stop being a soldier when being a soldier means protecting others. And Tucker had just been waiting for the right reason to come back, and training. The next generation was apparently that reason. 3 weeks passed and Danny received a message on his datapad telling him to report to a military facility on the outskirts of the city. And the message was brief and simply said that Colonel Tucker requested his presence for the strike team training program. And Danny took a personal day from his security job and drove to the coordinates provided. And the facility was surrounded by high fences and security checkpoints, and he had to show his credentials 3 times before being allowed inside, and a young lieutenant met him at the entrance and escorted him through several corridors to a large training room, where 20 candidates stood in formation wearing standard military fatigues. Tucker stood at the front of the room, and he was wearing a colonel's uniform for the first time since Danny had met him, and the sight was jarring, because the expensive suit had made Tucker look like a civilian businessman, but the uniform revealed what he truly was, which was a warrior and a leader, and someone who had commanded respect through actions rather than rank. And Tucker's medals were displayed on his chest, and they caught the light as he moved, and the candidates were watching him, with expressions ranging from nervousness to excitement to determination, and Tucker's eyes swept across the formation, taking measure of each person, and when he noticed Danny standing at the back of the room, he nodded once in acknowledgement. Tucker began speaking, and his voice carried authority, and he told the candidates that they had been selected from thousands of applicants because they showed potential, but potential meant nothing without preparation and training and sacrifice. And he said that most strike operations failed, not because of enemy action, but because of poor preparation and inadequate training and overconfidence. And he would not send anyone into combat until he was absolutely certain they were ready, and if that took 6 months or a year or 2 years, then that's how long it would take. And anyone who had a problem with that could leave now, and nobody moved. and Tucker nodded approvingly and continued his speech. Tucker explained that being part of a strike team wasn't about being the strongest or the fastest or the best shot, and it was about being smart and adaptable and willing to sacrifice for your teammates. And he said the Vereth were attacking human colonies because they believed humans were weak and divided and easy to defeat, and the strike team's job was to prove them wrong, and to hit the Vereth where they were vulnerable, and to make them understand that attacking humanity came with a price. And Tucker's expression was hard, and he said that some of the candidates in this room would not make it through training, and that was fine, because it was better to fail in training than to fail in combat, where failure meant death. Tucker called Danny forward and told the candidates that Officer Price would be teaching them about threat assessment and avoiding bias and making decisions under pressure, and several candidates looked confused because Danny was clearly not military, and Tucker explained that Price had made a mistake at a funeral 3 weeks ago and detained someone based on appearance rather than behavior, and Price had recognized his error and learned from it, and that kind of self-awareness and willingness to improve was exactly what Tucker wanted in his team members, and Danny felt his face get hot with embarrassment, but also pride because Tucker was using his mistake as a teaching moment rather than a source of shame. Over the following weeks, Danny visited the facility regularly and taught classes on security procedures and threat recognition, and he worked with the candidates on identifying genuine threats versus perceived threats based on unconscious bias. And some candidates struggled with the concepts while others grasped them immediately. And Danny found that he enjoyed teaching and helping others avoid the mistakes he had made, and he also observed Tucker's training methods, which were demanding but fair, and Tucker pushed the candidates hard but never beyond what they could handle, and he paid attention to each person's strengths and weaknesses and adapted his instruction accordingly, and Danny saw why Tucker had been such an effective commander. One afternoon, Tucker asked Danny to stay after class, and they walked to Tucker's office, which was sparse and functional, with only a desk and a few chairs and a wall covered in photographs, and the photos showed members of Strike Team 7 in various situations, and some were taken during training, while others were from combat zones, and Tucker pointed to one photo and said that was taken the day before the Battle of Kepler Station, and everyone in the photo was smiling and relaxed, and 3 of them would be dead within 24 hours, and Tucker said he kept the photos as a reminder that training matters and preparation matters, and every decision a commander makes can mean the difference between life and death. Tucker told Danny that he was doing good work with the candidates, and several of them had specifically mentioned how much they learned from his classes, and Tucker said that Danny had a gift for teaching and for helping people recognize their blind spots. And he asked if Danny had ever considered joining the military, and Danny admitted that he had thought about it when he was younger, but had chosen law enforcement instead, and Tucker nodded and said that both paths involved service and protecting others, and what mattered was doing the job well and with integrity. And Danny felt a warmth in his chest because Tucker's approval meant something and meant more than Danny had expected. Tucker opened a drawer and pulled out a folder and said he wanted to show Danny something, and the folder contained profiles of the candidates, and Tucker went through each one explaining their backgrounds and motivations and why he had selected them. And there was Lieutenant Marcus Cole, who grew up on a colony that was attacked by raiders and lost his family and wanted to prevent others from experiencing that pain. And there was Specialist Sandra Kim, who was an engineer and could build or repair almost anything, and had volunteered specifically because she wanted to support combat operations. And there was Corporal Juan Rodriguez, who spoke 6 languages and had a gift for understanding alien cultures and could negotiate or gather intelligence with equal skill. Tucker explained that a successful strike team needed diversity, not just in skills but in perspectives and backgrounds and experiences, and he had deliberately selected candidates from different colonies and different ethnic backgrounds and different military specialties because homogeneous teams developed blind spots and made assumptions that got people killed. And Danny understood that Tucker was building something special and something that reflected the best of humanity, and the team would succeed not despite their differences but because of them. And Tucker closed the folder and said that in 2 weeks they would take the candidates to Arlington Cemetery and show them the memorial wall and teach them the names of Strike Team 7 and help them understand the cost of failure. 2 weeks later, the candidates stood in formation at Arlington National Cemetery, and it was early morning and the air was cool, and Danny stood beside Tucker watching the 20 young soldiers who represented humanity's next generation of defenders. And Tucker had insisted on this visit despite protests from some military officials who thought it was morbid or unnecessary. But Tucker had been firm and said that anyone who went into combat needed to understand what they were fighting for and what previous generations had sacrificed, and the candidates were silent and respectful, as Tucker led them to the memorial wall where thousands of names were engraved in black stone. Tucker stopped in front of the section dedicated to Strike Team 7, and he began reading names, and with each name he told a story, and he described Lieutenant Commander Helen Briggs, who was brilliant and brave and died covering their retreat, and Corporal Angela Martinez, who threw herself on a grenade, and Sergeant Leon Carter, who held a choke point alone for 15 minutes, and Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka, who sacrificed herself to save a transport full of civilians, and Private Samantha Woods, who died in Tucker's arms after a failed extraction, and Commander Jin Park, who was captured and tortured but never revealed operational details, and Specialist Kyle Harper, who was killed by friendly fire in the confusion of battle and staff. Sergeant Linda Chen, who died from wounds sustained protecting wounded teammates. The candidates listened, and some had tears in their eyes, and Tucker's voice remained steady. But Danny could hear the strain and the weight of memory, and Tucker explained that these weren't just names, and they were people with families and dreams, and futures that were cut short. And every decision a commander made carried the weight of these lives, and he told the candidates that if they deployed and if they followed his training, then they had a good chance of coming home, but there were no guarantees in combat, and sometimes good soldiers died for bad reasons, and luck mattered as much as skill, and they needed to understand that before they committed to this path. Tucker asked if anyone wanted to leave and said there would be no shame in it, and that choosing life over glory was a valid decision. And 3 candidates stepped forward, and Tucker nodded respectfully and thanked them for their honesty, and said they had made the right choice for themselves, and the 3 candidates left, and the remaining 17 stood straighter and more determined. And Tucker told them they would visit this wall every week during training, and they would learn every name and every story, because remembering the dead was part of being a good soldier, and honoring sacrifice was part of earning the right to serve. Training continued for 6 more months, and it was brutal and comprehensive, and the candidates learned combat tactics and alien languages and survival skills and technical systems, and they practiced in simulated environments and real wilderness, and they were pushed to their limits and beyond, and 4 more candidates washed out because they couldn't handle the pressure, or didn't work well in teams, or made repeated mistakes that could get people killed in real operations. And Tucker never shamed those who left and always thanked them for trying. And the remaining 13 became close and developed the kind of bond that only forms through shared hardship and mutual trust. Danny continued teaching his classes and grew close to several candidates, including Lieutenant Marcus Cole, who reminded Danny of a younger version of Tucker with the same quiet intensity and dedication, and Specialist Sandra Kim, who had a gift for finding humor in difficult situations and kept morale high, and Corporal Juan Rodriguez, who became Danny's unofficial assistant and helped develop training scenarios about cultural awareness and bias recognition. And Danny realized that he had found something he didn't know he was looking for, which was purpose and community, and the satisfaction of helping prepare people for important work. Finally, graduation day arrived, and the 13 remaining candidates stood in dress uniforms, and Tucker inspected them with the same careful attention he gave everything, and Danny stood with other instructors and felt pride watching these young soldiers who had worked so hard and learned so much, and Admiral Keene attended the ceremony along with other high-ranking officers and representatives from the Galactic Council, and Tucker gave a speech that was brief and direct, and he told the candidates that they were ready, and that he trusted them, and that they carried the legacy of Strike Team 7 and all who came before, and their job was to protect humanity and come home alive, and in that order. Tucker presented each graduate with a patch that showed Strike Team 9's insignia, and it featured a phoenix rising from flames, which symbolized humanity's ability to survive and adapt and overcome. And each candidate saluted Tucker and shook his hand, and several had tears in their eyes because they understood the significance of what they were receiving and the responsibility they were accepting. And when the ceremony ended, Tucker looked exhausted but satisfied, and Danny approached him and said he was proud to have been part of this, and Tucker smiled and said that Danny had done more than teach classes, and he had helped shape how these soldiers thought about people and situations, and that would save lives. 2 weeks later, Strike Team 9 deployed to the Outer Rim, and their mission was to gather intelligence on Vareth positions and disrupt supply lines, and demonstrate that human colonies were not easy targets. And Danny watched the news feeds anxiously, waiting for updates. And Tucker remained at the facility monitoring communications and coordinating with Fleet Command and providing guidance when needed, and the team performed brilliantly and executed their operations with precision and creativity. And after 3 months they returned home, and all 13 members were alive and several were wounded but recovering. And the mission was declared a complete success. Danny attended the welcome home ceremony and watched as families embraced their returning soldiers, and Tucker stood to the side, observing with quiet satisfaction, and Lieutenant Cole approached Tucker and reported that the team had followed his training exactly, and it had worked, and they were alive because of what he taught them. And Tucker's expression softened, and he said they were alive because they were smart and careful and worked together, and they had earned this victory. And Cole smiled and said that Tucker was wrong about one thing, and that they were heroes, and Tucker was too. And Tucker shook his head but accepted the compliment with grace. Later that evening, Danny found Tucker standing alone at the memorial wall and touching the names of Strike Team 7. And Danny approached quietly and stood beside him, and they were silent for a moment. And then Tucker said that maybe Helen and Angela and the others would be proud, and maybe their deaths had meaning if they led to this and to better training and better preparation, and soldiers who came home alive. And Danny said he thought they would be proud, and that Tucker had honored them by making sure their lessons weren't forgotten, and Tucker nodded and said that was all any soldier could ask for, which was to be remembered and to have their sacrifice mean something. Danny pulled out the Medal of Valor that Tucker had given him months ago, and he had carried it every day since. And he told Tucker that he wanted to thank him because that day at the funeral had changed his life and taught him to see people differently, and to question his assumptions, and to understand that service came in many forms. And Tucker said that Danny had done the work and had chosen to learn and grow, and that took courage. And Danny smiled and said he learned it from watching Tucker, who carried impossible weight with dignity and turned pain into purpose and taught others to do the same. And Tucker was quiet, and then said that maybe they had both learned something, and maybe that was the point. They stood together at the memorial wall as the sun set and cast long shadows across the cemetery, and Danny thought about how much had changed since that morning when he detained a suspicious man at a funeral, and how a moment of prejudice had become a moment of growth, and how mistakes could become lessons if you were willing to face them honestly. And Tucker had taught him that, and had taught Strike Team 9 that, and would teach future generations that. And Danny understood now that heroes weren't always the people who fought, and sometimes they were the people who remembered and honored and prepared others, and taught them to be better than they were. And Tucker was all of those things, and always would be.